to the top. And we'll hand it over to Petra to please introduce John.
Thank you, Nanoa. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to kick off part 1 of our June workshop series here around the art of story crafting. There's research to suggest that when we hear a story, not only are the language processing parts in our brain activated, but any other area in our brain that we use when experiencing the events of the story are as well. And another interesting fact is that storytelling is central to our meaning making and sense making. It is through story that our minds form and examine our own truths and beliefs, as well as discern how they correlate with the truths and beliefs of others. And through story listening, we also gain new perspectives and a better understanding of the world around us. We actually challenge and expand our own understanding by exploring how others see and understand the world through their lens. So while sharing and listening to each other's stories, we all get a little bit closer to what you could consider the truth. And to my great joy, we have John Bucher here today to help guide us on a story crafting journey, and do so again on June 21st and June 28th. We'll fill you in on that at the end of the session today. John is a writer, mythologist, and storyteller based out of Hollywood, California. He serves as creative director for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is also an author, podcaster, and speaker. He has worked with companies including HBO, DC Comics, the History Channel, A24 Films, Atlas Obscura, the John Maxwell Leadership Foundation, and served as a producer, consultant, and writer for numerous films, television, and virtual reality projects. He is the author of 6 books, including the best-selling Storytelling for Virtual Reality, named by Book Authority as one of the best storytelling books of all time. Disruptor named him one of the top 25 influencers in virtual reality. I actually encourage you to browse John's website for some really interesting clips and interviews, and we'll put that link in the chat for everyone. John teaches writing, myth, and story courses in the Los Angeles area and around the world. He holds a PhD in mythology and depth psychology and has spoken on 6 continents about using the power of story and myth to reframe how individuals, organizations, cultures, and nations are viewed. I have personally had the great pleasure to work with John and hope you all agree after our first session today, we couldn't be luckier than to have him share his broad experience and expertise working in this space. And so without further ado, I turn it over to you, John, with a very warm welcome from your ICF member coaches and our cherished guests today.
Oh, thank you so much. What a delight and joy to be with all of you today. I have been greatly looking forward to this. As a PCC certified coach myself, it's just good to be with our tribe, right? It's good to be with our people. And this is a delight for me to come in and be able to share with you today. I have to begin every session that I talk about storytelling, of course, with a story. So with your permission, we'll open each one of these sessions with a brief story. And I like to share stories from the trenches in my client work. And I like to tell stories about this particular client, which doesn't really exist, but is sort of an amalgam of a lot of different clients that I've had. But I like to call this character Calvin Client. So Calvin Client is a client of mine that I'll be sharing some stories about along the way. Late one night, Calvin Client was speeding down an empty road just outside of Los Angeles. And sure enough, a policeman saw Calvin Client speeding right past and pulled out and pulled over Calvin Client. And he walked up to Calvin and he said, are you aware of how fast that you were going? Well, Calvin said, Absolutely, officer. I'm definitely aware of how fast I was going. You have to understand, I'm trying to escape this robbery that I was involved in. Well, the policeman looked at him disbelievingly and said, sir, were you the one being robbed? Well, Calvin casually replied, oh, no. I was the one who committed the robbery. I was trying to escape, actually. Well, the policeman was just shocked and surprised, and he couldn't believe that Calvin was admitting this so freely. So he said, so you're telling me that you were speeding and you committed a robbery? Calvin said, oh, absolutely, officer, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I've got all the money I took from the bank that I robbed in the trunk right now. So now the policeman's just starting to be getting angry. He can't even believe this. He says, sir, I'm afraid you're going to have to come with me. Well, the policeman reaches into the car to take the keys out of the ignition, and Calvin shouts, don't do that. I'm afraid that you'll see the gun that I have in the glove box here. Well, the cop just shakes his head at this point, and he says, wait right here. And he goes and he, of course, calls for backup. And all of these policemen just come to the scene, and soon there are cop cars everywhere, and there's helicopters flying all over the scene everywhere that you look. And the policemen drag Calvin, my client, out of his car, and they handcuff him, and they start to move him over to another police car to take him into the jail. But just before they put Calvin in the car, the lieutenant walked over to him and said, sir, this officer tells us that you had committed robbery and had stolen all this money from a bank and have it in the trunk of your car, and that you've got this loaded gun inside your glove compartment. We looked and we didn't find any of those things in your car. And Calvin looked at the lieutenant and he said, yeah, and I bet that liar said I was speeding too. See, sometimes our clients can be quite the characters, can't they? They can be quite the characters. And I have had stories like this told in so many different instances in my practices. I don't know about you, but storytelling is just an inherent part of coaching. And I'm so glad to be able to share some insights into the art of storytelling with you today. So is that wonderful introduction that Petra gave me, I appreciate so much, said. I do a lot of different things. I really value coaching is part of everything that I do. And I consider myself someone who works in creative story-based coaching. And that looks very different in a lot of different ways. I work with a group out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming called Mentor Agility that has a wonderful coach training program, and you should check out what they do at mentoragility.com. They're wonderful folks that have a wonderful program that I teach a lot of different story-based courses through. But I have to tell you, at the end of the day, with all the work that I do and all the different things that I'm involved in, there's nothing that I do, from consulting in Hollywood to working with the Joseph Campbell Foundation and Myth, there's nothing I do that doesn't touch the art of storytelling. Storytelling is just so inherent to everything I'm a part of. I am so fortunate that I just got back from Australia just a couple of weeks ago, where the government had invited me over to actually coach these Indigenous leaders that the government is supporting and funding. And I was amazed to set and learn from these incredible men and women about their culture and their work there in Australia. I was able to hold two things at the same time. One, I was blown away by the universal nature of coaching and how coaching is so powerfully universal that I can travel halfway around the world and set with people and use my coaching skills to have impact with these people that are from a culture so different than mine. And at the same time, on the other hand, I was able to hold this amazing opportunity to learn from these incredible leaders and understand that coaching is universal and it's highly specific. And I was able to learn about the specific nuances of coaching someone from a very different culture that I was unfamiliar with. And I think this is something that we as coaches can be doing constantly. Every new client that comes into our practice is a new opportunity to learn about a new culture, a new framework, and a new way of viewing the world. And I value that greatly. Every new client is going to present new challenges, but every new client also presents new opportunities for us to broaden the scope of our field as coaches. Here's a quick agenda for what we're going to do the next 3 sessions together. I'm so excited about this time that I get to spend with all of you. Today, we're going to be focusing on the simple elements of story, just the basics of story and what to look for in a client story and what those things could suggest about your work with a client. In next week's session, we're going to be turning our stories into questions. We know as coaches, the most powerful tool that we have as a coach is a well-crafted, articulated question. And how can we use these stories and these questions to go deeper in a short amount of time and understand our clients' stories better? In the third session, we're going to work together to build a metaphor toolkit. We're going to try and locate and use metaphors that might work in your practice to understand and open up a client's story. But before we get to all that, let's focus on today. Today, we're going to be talking about a straightforward framework for understanding and creating simple stories in client work. Let's jump right in. I think it's important for us as we begin to jump into these ideas to recognize that there is a difference between what I like to call story frameworks and storytelling. See, when we hear this idea of storytelling, we sometimes may think only of the types of stories like I told at the beginning of this session, right? Where we're just telling a basic story that might be funny, it might be dramatic. Here's the funny thing I've discovered. Everyone seems to know what a story is until they sit down to tell one. And then we get a lot of different ideas about what a story is, right? How many people out there have that friend or that client that they tell these stories that just meander on and they ramble and go on and you just never know where the story's going or how it's going to end. But then most of us have that person in our family who's the storyteller. It's that person, that uncle, that aunt, that grandmother, that father or mother, that brother or sister, someone in the family that just seems to have a gift for telling stories. And if we look closely at what is it that some people have, I would suggest that storytelling, well, certain people are gifted for it. Storytelling is a skill that can be learned, and it is a skill that we can improve and get better at. I believe that storytelling gets us back to these ancient questions that human beings have been asking since the beginning of time. As I mentioned, I do work with the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and Joseph Campbell once famously said that he believed that people weren't so much looking for the meaning of life as much as they were the rapturous experience of being alive. At the end of the day, I think this is what we're looking for in a good story. We're looking for the experience of having been alive. If I were to ask you, tell me about the best day of your life. tell me what happened that day. It might not be a great story, right? It might just be something that you were able to, go with family on this wonderful trip and everything just came together well and you had a great meal. It might not be a great story, but the greatest day of your life is probably going to be expressed through what I call a story framework. See, when we talk about storytelling and coaching, and when we talk about story in general in coaching, we're talking not only about the action of storytelling, but we're talking about the approach to story in general. We're talking about using the elements of story. So, we're going to talk about what some of those elements are, but a story has some basic things. For example, a story has characters. Can you think of any story you've ever heard that didn't involve characters? Stories have to have characters. Even if this is a story about a shoe that lives in my closet, I still make that shoe a character. We tend to put human characteristics on objects because we tell stories about characters. Even when we tell stories about animals, we make those animals somewhat human. Have you ever noticed that? The stories we tell are about characters. And so often, the stories that we tell are about human beings. They're about people. When we tell stories about objects or animals, we usually put human qualities on them. But I want us to get this idea from the very beginning that when we talk about storytelling, this is the act of telling a story. It may be a story we tell to our children before bed at night. It may be the story of the person that almost ran into us on the way to work, one day. It may be the story of how we won a magical toaster that now makes the best toast we could ever ask for. It could be any of these types of stories, but a story framework is much looser. It doesn't have to have all of those things. One of the things we're going to be talking about quite a bit over the next 3 sessions is our idea of what a metaphor is. Because so often as coaches, we use metaphor in coaching. We're trying to find ways to open up those things inside of a client's journey and a client's experience that turn on the light bulb, right? We want them to come to this self-discovery because we know the answers they're looking for are inside of them. And so what we're trying to do in using metaphor is help them connect dots through these powerful questions, that we form. I highly recommend leaning into metaphor as part of the story framework. And we're going to look at some specific ways to do that in our sessions together, but I can't say enough about how important metaphor is in our coaching work. The second thing that I want to point out about these story frameworks, or this idea of the story approach that we can bring to coaching, is that there's a specific language of story. And the specific language of story involves terms that people may or may not have a bit of an emotional reaction to. For example, the word character. So I just said, every story has characters. Well, some people are fine with that. Some people say, yeah, absolutely, every story has characters. But if a client shares a story with me and they mention a person in that story and I respond back to them, oh, tell me more about that character of Sarah. That client may have a reaction to that. That client may have an emotional reaction and say, well, Sarah's a person. Sarah's not a character. And sometimes there is a bit of resistance in some clients in thinking about the stories that they're sharing out of their own lives as stories. Sometimes people say, no, this really happened. This is not a story. Not recognizing that these are all stories. Just some stories happen to be true, right? I would also suggest to you that some stories are more than true. So when I use a metaphor like, oh, I love my partner so much, I would go down and lay in traffic for my partner. Now, does that mean I'm literally going to go and lay down in traffic for my partner? No, of course not. But I use that metaphor and you get exactly what I mean, right? You understand that what he's saying is not literally true, but it's more than true. It expresses something that we feel inside of ourselves, even though the words are lacking. I would suggest to you sometimes, as coaches, it's tough to find the words, right? It's tough to find the right articulation. It's tough to find the right words to ask the client. It's tough to find the question. Sometimes the best we can do is metaphor. Sometimes metaphor speaks to us in ways that reality doesn't. One of the things I often will ask the clients that I work with is it like this? And I might share a story and say, there's this story of three bears that go and come home and find that someone has eaten their porridge. Does it feel like your porridge has been eaten? It can be that simple sometimes. The language of story is something we have to navigate with different clients. But I'll say this, I have yet to meet a client who didn't love some aspect of story or storytelling, because story is universal. It's something that we as people gravitate to. We can't exist without telling stories. I would dare to venture every single person on this Zoom call has told a number of stories already today, and probably had a number of stories told to you already today. I know you've had at least one, because I told you a story at the beginning of the session. The third thing that we're going to go much deeper on next week is this relationship between stories and questions. I don't have any young children, but I have these nephews that I just adore and am in love with my nephews. I love to go and watch my nephews play with each other. And they're two young boys that are similar in age. And I notice that sometimes when my nephews play, they don't play with each other, they play near each other. But they like for the other person to be in the room. They like for the other nephew to be there, but they like just playing near each other. So I have a friend who's a psychologist that told me, oh yes, this is parallel play. It's an important part of child psychology where two children play near each other, but not with each other. Well, I would suggest to you in many ways that using story and metaphor in coaching is sort of like that parallel play. Sometimes we can get to the deeper truths of something that are hard to talk about by talking about them in terms of metaphor, by talking about them in terms of story, by sharing a story of someone who went through something similar or a character who experienced something similar. Sometimes it gives a client the language that can be helpful to them. That relationship between stories and questions is so significant. It gives us an endless supply of things to work with in our client work. I think it's important, as we talk about storytelling in our client work, that we're able to truly hear a client's story when they share it. There's a couple of things that I watch for, and some of these are deeply connected to coaching. And any of you who have achieved any sort of certification with ICF are going to recognize that some of these are closely connected to things that we are expected to know and to be observing in our coaching work. And the first thing I'd like to talk about for a moment as it relates to story is body language. Oftentimes when a client shares a story, it is the moment I pay the most attention to a client's body language. Why is that the case? Because when we tell a story, many times we get out of our own heads and we start speaking from the heart. We're telling stories about people that we care about. We're telling stories about things that matter to us. And in doing that, we often get out of our own way and out of our own heads, and we start to speak from this very authentic place, and our body language becomes very, very unconscious. So there's a few things that I tend to pay attention to. One of the things that I pay attention to whenever a client is telling a story, I pay attention to where their eyes go. I pay attention to where their eyes go, because many times that client, when they're telling a story, they stop looking at me. They get lost in their own story, and they may be looking off into space, and they are seeing something that is happening in this story. And I just happen to be a silent partner in the room. They are really having this silent conversation with themselves at that point. And can I tell you a secret? That is when coaching starts to hit another level. Is when a client is having this conversation with themselves and we get to be the witness of it. True deep work is starting to happen in those moments. When a client's eyes come back to me while they're telling a story, it's usually because they're checking in. They want to know, are you hearing me? Are you hearing this story that I'm telling? Is this story having impact on me? I, as a coach, will often try to make sure whenever that client's eyes are going to come back and check in with me, I want to make sure my eyes can meet theirs, because it's a subtle, silent way of letting that client know, I'm hearing you, I'm engaging with you. I completely am resonating with this story that you're telling me. The second part of body language that I watch when a client tells a story, I watch what their hands do. Now, this varies from client to client. Some of us really use our hands a lot, and we just talk with our hands, and it would be nearly impossible for us to tell a story without using our hands. Others, we don't use our hands at all, and we can tell that story exactly the same way, and our hands never leave our sides. And so we have to recognize that certain clients have certain styles, and some are more comfortable using their hands than others. However, any hand movement or any hand gestures or any use of the hand is important. Did you know there's a big difference between me having an open hand like this when I tell a story, and if I have a closed fist while I'm telling that story? That closed fist usually means, oh, I'm feeling passion about this. That passion may be anger. That passion may be frustration. That passion may be just such a deep passion that I want my point to get across. So I have to dot the I's and cross the T's in the air so that you know what I'm saying. And sometimes with those open hands, I say, I just didn't know what to do. And I'm putting my hands upwards because I was at a loss. I was at a loss. Other times a client will use their hands to say, oh, I was feeling kind of wishy-washy. I wasn't sure what to do. And we see their hands making these wishy-washy shapes in the story that they're telling. And still other times, we'll see hands be used to articulate and provide gestures for moments that they want to emphasize. Sometimes a client won't move their hands at all until the end of the story they're telling. And then in the last moment, they'll use their hand to say, that was when I knew I had to leave my job. And it's those moments that we can watch for and gain things from, that we can then respond back with questions. If I saw a client do that and use their hand and say, that was the moment I knew I had to leave my job, I would immediately ask that client, I noticed the passion in your voice, and I noticed the way that you used your hand to articulate the end of that story and that point that you made. Tell me about what came up in your body that made you want to use that hand, that made it necessary for you to articulate that moment in such a way. Tell me about what was happening with your body. Oh, people will open up in those moments. People will open up and begin to share with you exactly what's happening in their bodies. See, many clients tell stories with their whole body, right? Their whole body gets into it. You can watch some people's feet will be moving up and down. Some people will be shaking and moving their legs. Some people's shoulders get into it. Some people's neck, their head is going everywhere. But clients are giving us so much information through their body language, especially when they tell a story. See, when clients are giving us just pure information, they can be very guarded because they have this gatekeeper who's being very careful about what they share. But when a client tells a story, that gatekeeper goes out for a coffee break. The gatekeeper is no longer on the job, and things begin to just pour out of the client through their body and through the things that they're saying. The third thing that I notice in a client's body language is I watch what happens with the shapes in their mouth. When a client tells a story, sometimes you can catch these little subtle smiles. Sometimes in that story, the corners of their mouth turn down, and you can tell that they're sad. Sometimes you can see things just in the little shapes that we make with our mouths about exactly what's going on inside of someone. I've been amazed sometimes as a client has shared with me a story that was very meaningful or very difficult for them. I've noticed a slight tremble begin to occur in their lip. These often are clients that would never cry in a session, or they might never become very emotional, but we can sometimes notice there's a slight tremble in someone's lip. There's these portals in our body, right, where emotions come through, and they tend to be these portals that have holes in them, right? Our eyes, the emotions come through the holes in the eyes. The nose, we'll see nostrils flare sometimes when someone tells a story, and then this big hole in the front, our mouth, right? We'll tend to see things happen with emotion coming out there. I have one client that I just love so dearly. She's wonderful, and she tells me that she has a leaking problem with her eyes, because everything that she talks about in every session, her eyes begin to leak, and she's just precious and dear, and I love that her emotions are that close to the surface. But she's well aware that her emotions, they leak out of her eyes. Nothing happens with her nose or with her mouth, but boy, her stories all leak right out of her eyes. The second thing that I think is really important in hearing a client's story, truly hearing a client's story, is this idea of subtext. See, the subtext is what's happening that a client may not directly be saying. Sometimes a client will come in 3 or 4 sessions in a row, and they will talk about how difficult their job is. And the subtext of what they're saying is, I really want to leave my job, but I'm afraid. And we have to be able to listen and hear more than just what is being said in the words that a client shares. We have to be able to listen and catch the subtext of what's really being said. This takes listening closely. It usually takes doing a few sessions with the client before we begin to pick up on the subtext of what a client is saying, because they may not say something directly, but often it's the tone of a story that they tell. We have to listen for the tone of a client's story. I want to give you a couple of tips for hearing the essential elements in a client's story. And I'll be giving more of these in coming sessions, but one of the tips I want to give you right up front is to listen for the characters in a client's story. There's that word characters again, an essential for storytelling. Why is it important to listen for the characters in a client's story? I would suggest to you, if you start hearing stories about the same characters over and over, there's something to dig into there. I have a client who she would often tell me stories about this particular woman that she worked with, and she never really said much negative about this person. But one day I asked her, I said, I noticed you tell me stories about Lisa quite a bit. Tell me about Lisa. Well, Lisa is the whole reason that I have not been able to excel in my job there. Lisa is the person that, and she gave me an earful about how difficult Lisa is. Now, she had never said anything negative about Lisa before, but Lisa kept coming up in her stories. Lisa was a reappearing character. I knew that there was some sort of energy behind Lisa there that we needed to dig into. This was in the subtext of what she was saying. She never said anything negative about Lisa, but there was always a bit of a tone in her voice when she talked about Lisa that made it clear, oh, there's something happening here. There's something that we should explore and dig into. And sure enough, there was a lot there. There was a lot there. I'm going to offer you one other tip here before we move forward. But again, I will be coming back to these, quite a bit. Not only listen for the characters in your client's story, listen for the places. Listen for the places in your client's story. There's a creative gentleman that I coach who is a creative person here in Hollywood, and he is often telling me stories about what happens to him in this particular coffee shop that he goes to in Los Angeles. And he's like, oh, I was at this coffee shop the other day, and he says the name of the coffee shop, and he will tell me what happened. And I noticed this coffee shop kept coming up time and time again. And I asked him in one session, I said, I noticed that in a number of these stories that you shared with me, this coffee shop keeps coming up. Tell me about this coffee shop. Tell me about what you experience when you're in this coffee shop. He said, John, that coffee shop is my sanctuary. That coffee shop is where I go to make decisions. It's where I go to think about what's happening in my work. Well, this immediately led me to ask him, what is it about that coffee shop that makes it a sanctuary for you? And he began to unpack what he needed in a space for it to be a sanctuary for him. Well, this ended up leading to us talking about, sanctuaries at home and things of that nature. What is your home a sanctuary? And what might you do to bring some of those elements of the coffee shop into your home where there's a sanctuary at home? It led to all sorts of exploration between the two of us that only came out because I was listening for people and places that came up time and time again in these client stories. The last thing that we're going to talk to here about, and I see on my slide here that I used a funny font, so excuse that for some of the text there at the bottom, but the main points came through. So we'll just pay attention to the left-hand side of the screen. Pay no attention to the right-hand side of the screen. I've mentioned to you already that stories are about people. One of the things that I've noticed is that the best stories that clients share, that I can share with anyone, are simple stories. The mistakes people make in storytelling are they try and tell a story that's far too complex. People really don't like complex stories. People like simple stories with complex characters. Why? Because we're complex people, right? Human beings are complex. We can't help it. It's just who we are. We're complex. And so people tend to gravitate towards simple stories with complex characters. There are some stories that have been around since the beginning of time, and we just keep telling them over and over again. This is what our friend Joseph Campbell shared with us when he was alive, is that we keep telling the same stories over and over again. There have been so many ancient stories about a human being trying to catch a fish. And then in the 1800s, Herman Melville wrote a book called Moby Dick that was highly successful about a man just trying to catch a fish. And then in the 1970s, a guy named Steven Spielberg made a movie called Jaws. And it was a story about a man trying to catch a fish. It seems as though trying to catch a fish is a pretty universal human story. We keep telling that story over and over and over again. There are universal stories, and they're so simple. It's the characters that are complex. If you've done coaching work for any amount of time, you start hearing the same stories over and over and over and over again. It's not the stories that become more complex. It's the complex people that's set in front of us as coaches. Stories are about people. Stories are about want. See, in a simple story, somebody wants something. There's a big difference between a scenario and a story. See, a scenario is just a cat lying on a blanket. It's not really a story, it's just a cat lying on a blanket. We could make up a story about it, but a cat lying on a blanket is not a story. A cat lying on a dog's blanket, now that's a story. Why? Because we have characters and we have want. Those two, that cat and that dog, they both want the blanket. They both want the blanket, and guess what? That's going to lead to conflict, and stories are about conflict. Even the sweetest, most good-natured Disney movie is still a story about conflict. It's still a story about somebody wanting something and someone else standing in the way of that, causing some sort of conflict. And like people, conflict can be nuanced. It can be complex. Not every conflict is external. Sometimes, especially in the world of coaching, the conflicts people experience are inside of them. They're external. But one of the greatest ways to deal with internal conflict is through external metaphor. External storytelling is one of the best ways to deal with the internal conflict within us. Stories are about what people want, but as coaches, we have to ask, what is it at the basis of that desire? Why do you want that so much? What does life look like once you have it? These are the questions that make a story rich. We're going to be moving into our Q&A time right now. And as you start thinking about your questions that you have, I would love to leave you with two big questions to be thinking about this week. These are important questions that connect story and coaching. The first question is, how are you currently using story in working with your clients? Now, this could be intentional. You could be very deliberate. Someone in the chat at the beginning said they were using wisdom stories, which I think is brilliant and wonderful and awesome. So that's an example of someone being intentional with using stories. But it may be unintentional. You may be using story and storytelling in your coaching practice, and it may be completely unintentional. You may be using story very consciously by asking clients about their story, or it may be very unconsciously that you're using story. But how are you currently using story in working with clients? Another way to ask this question is, how does it come up in your sessions? How does story or storytelling make an appearance in your sessions? The last type of question that I'd like you to be thinking about this week: what types of stories do you tend to hear over and again in your coaching practice? What are those stories that seem to come up over and again from clients in your coaching practice? Are they stories of regret, stories of revenge, stories of desire and want, stories of frustration? And then ask yourself, what types of stories do you tend to reiterate over and again in your coaching practice? What are the stories you as a coach tend to go to? What do you tend to, and maybe you don't use stories very much at all, but if you do use stories, and stories tend to come up and come out of your mouth in a coaching session, what are those stories that tend to reiterate? As a little teaser, I have some of the things coming up in our next session that we're going to be dealing with. 3 ways to use story to go deep with the client next week, 3 ways to turn stories into powerful questions, and 3 ways to interpret a story that a client shares with you. What I'd like to do now is turn things back over to Petra, and I just have to say again, thank you for this invitation. I'm already excited about week 2 next week in our second session. So Petra, please join me.
John, we're still probably in awe about what we just learned. So inspiring, and love the things you pointed out, to observe. I think we've all seen it or heard it, and definitely brings back into memory. Those are really some of the markers that we always want to be mindful of. I wanted to give anyone a chance, as Nano had already mentioned, we're opening this up for a few minutes here for questions while we still have John here to guide that, and wanted all of you to please put your questions either in the chat if you haven't done so already, and then maybe Nano, if you wanted to just monitor that for a few minutes before we wrap up today, that would be great. Oh, we got quite a bunch here.
I'm seeing
Mr. Rogers.
Yes, I love Mr.
I'm sure
Rogers.
you have some things to add there.
I love Mr. Rogers. Oh, and puppets. I love puppets. I see this wonderful question here. What is the difference between story and information? Do stories underlie information that a client would give us? For instance, being unhappy with your job is information, not a story, right? Oh, what a wonderful question. I love that you've asked this question because I think this is really important. Stories tend to give us information about the clients, but we have to be able to interpret those stories to take the information away. And this is something we'll be talking about next week, is how do we interpret a story tells, how do we pull that information from a client? I think you said it well in your question here. Do stories underlie information that a client would give us? Yes. In a story, we not only are listening for the specifics that a client might explicitly state in a story, but as a reminder, we're listening for that subtext. What is sort of the underlying theme that we can read in their body language and the tone of their voice as they talk and tell that story? What information are they providing to us? Because oftentimes when it comes to information a client is wanting to provide to us, the client will often directly state that information. You know, they will often say, I want to get a promotion in my work, and I want us to work with that, you know, in our session today. They will give us information, but oftentimes the information that comes out in a story is information that a client, either one, may not really have the language to articulate for themselves, or number two, may be hesitant to admit it to themselves. Oftentimes in stories, I will have a client tell me a story about their work, and I will ask them, it sounds to me like you are looking for an exit ramp out of that work. And I can't tell you how many times a client has said, you know, I guess I just need to admit that to myself. But yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And that, I think, is an important thing to be listening for. I heard, or I saw someone else's question, how do we bring in metaphor without derailing the client's story? I think this is such an important question, because we want to let clients finish their story before we ask any questions or offer metaphor. I think it's very important to let someone finish a story. As tempting as it can be to say, "Ooh, I've got just the right metaphor to throw into this moment," it, as you mentioned, can really derail where their mind is going and where their train of thought is going. And can I tell you, one of the things I've had to learn as a coach that can be so challenging for me sometimes is sometimes I have the perfect metaphor for the right moment, but the client moves on and they work through it, and I never get to use it, and I just have to put that back in my pocket. Oh, isn't that hard to do? Isn't that the worst, when you say, oh, this would have been perfect at that moment, but the client's moved on, they've worked through it. I just need to put that back in my pocket for later. And as we mature as coaches, as we, you know, gain new experiences, we find gracious ways to do that with ourselves. So often we may later, you know, go out and have a cup of coffee and say, oh, I could have really given him that moment. But in the session is not the time to do that.
John, real quick, I have something that I thought would be cool to just touch on the last couple of minutes we have. We had here from Lori, she's touching a little bit on Tony Robbins and his idea of releasing stories that keeps people stuck. Curious to hear maybe how you differentiate the two, right? Or how do you approach that if that's something you detect in your work?
Yes, what a great question. Absolutely. So often people do, you know, that people have bought into these narratives that they are stuck in, right? This is the story that they keep telling themselves over and over again. And I call my work telling a better story for this reason, because oftentimes in life, I don't know what a good story or a bad story is in someone's life. I don't even know for my own life sometimes. I think, oh, this would be a good story if in my life, if this opportunity came to me. And what I don't know is that opportunity might completely wreck my whole career. I don't always know what a good story and a bad story is. What I'm in pursuit of is a better story. I think we can agree that sometimes a better story is as good as we can do. So I often ask my clients, if I sense that they're stuck in a story, I may reiterate the story I'm hearing back to them and say, you know, what would a better story sound like? Sometimes I take the client out of that environment and I say, you know, let me tell you about my friend Lori. And Lori is having this experience, or Lori is going through this, and it's some parallel thing to what the client is going through. And I will ask the client, what would you say to Lori? What would a better story for Lori look like? And it's funny, when you take someone out of the scenario, they will often chime right in and say, well, here's what a better story for Lori would look like. and then to be able to say, what would that story
Awesome.
look like for you?
John, we have one more question from Erica. She says, if you haven't thought of using stories in coaching, how do you begin to incorporate stories? How do you begin?
That is such an important question. Such an important question. I think the best way to begin to incorporate stories is to make yourself a small list of the issues or themes that often come up in your coaching work. So is it, is it frustration? Is it, those things? And once you've got maybe a list of maybe 3 things that come up often in your coaching work, themes, questions, begin to do a little research. And this is where the internet can be our dear friends, and look for stories that address those themes. Because it's probably because, I live right here in Hollywood, I often will say, tell me movies about redemption, Siri. Google, give me movies about, difficult relationships with your father. And I will then go and watch those movies, and see what that brings in me. I find movies, especially movies everyone's seen, like Wizard of Oz and E.T. and those movies that a lot of people have seen, those often are great stories to share in a client session, because I'll say, do you know the story of Cinderella? Well, almost everyone knows the story of Cinderella. And so just leaning towards those universal stories everyone's seen can be a great place, as long as you find the ones that connect with the themes that you have.
Love that. Thank you. Petra?
We want to be mindful here, even though it's so wonderful to continue of the time today. I do want everyone to please don't forget to register and join us again, as John mentioned, next week for part 2. And then actually there is the grand finale the following week. So our third part also in June on the 28th. Please do check our events calendar. We also want to just let you guys know to check for our chapter meeting tomorrow. We have Janet Harvey joining us for a second time on a wonderful topic, and she has a little article also for you guys to read as a preference to courageously disrupt. This is also very much relevant to how you craft your coaching session with your client. Want to thank everyone for joining us again. A big thank you to our member coaches, all our wonderful guests that were here today from far away. I thought I saw South Africa here, which is fantastic. So we're really broadening our range. John, wonderful session and wonderful kickoff. Thank you for being here. I think the inspiration definitely came through. So I can't wait to see what's happening next week. And again, have a wonderful remainder of your day. Nano will follow up with the CCEU, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Ciao.